Three true Skinwalker Forest horror stories. It was the start of a long-awaited weekend in the woods, just me and a few friends, away from the noise of the city. We pitched our tents in a dense, isolated forest, where trees loomed overhead, twisting together like they were trying to shut out the sky. The only path leading back to civilization was a narrow trail, barely visible among the ferns and roots. It felt wild and untouched, perfect for some downtime, or so we thought. Our first day was uneventful. We hiked, laughed, and shared stories. The forest was eerily quiet, almost like it was holding its breath, but we didn't think much of it. By sunset, we'd set up camp, and the golden light filtering through the trees softened the landscape. Nightfall crept in slowly, like a thick blanket spreading over the sky, casting our campsite into darkness. The silence returned, heavier this time, pressing down on us as if the woods themselves were holding back a secret. As we sat around the fire, one of my friends stopped mid-sentence, staring over my shoulder. I turned, my heart skipping a beat, expecting to see an animal or maybe another camper, but there was nothing, only the darkness. "Did you see that?" he whispered, still staring. A few of us laughed it off, teasing him, but the uneasy feeling stayed. We sat quietly, listening to the crackle of the fire, and in that silence I began to hear something else. Soft, shuffling sounds like footsteps just out of sight. I told myself it was the trees, or maybe a raccoon, but my gut said otherwise. The sounds grew louder, moving around our campsite in a slow, deliberate circle. Shadows seemed to pulse at the edges of our firelight, twisting and shifting, almost as if they were alive. We huddled closer together, each of us feeling the same suffocating dread but too afraid to voice it. Then there was a snap, a loud, purposeful crack from the trees. I turned toward the sound, my heart pounding, and there, just beyond the firelight, I saw it. A figure, tall and thin, standing perfectly still among the trees. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, maybe a tree casting a strange shadow, but as I watched, it moved. It stepped forward, its body contorted, its limbs bent at unnatural angles. My stomach churned. It looked almost human, but wrong. Its face was a pale, featureless mask, and as it stepped closer, I noticed that its mouth was open in a silent scream, stretching impossibly wide to reveal rows of jagged, glistening teeth. My blood ran cold. The fire's light seemed to waver, shrinking back from the figure, as if even it was afraid. "Run!" someone shouted, breaking the spell. We scrambled to our feet, abandoning everything, our tents, our gear, even our fire, as we bolted into the darkness. Branches scratched our faces, roots tried to trip us, but none of us looked back. I could still hear it behind us, the soft rustle of leaves, the snap of twigs. It was following us, watching, waiting. We ran until we found the trail, not stopping until we'd reached our cars, gasping for breath, our faces pale in the headlights. None of us spoke on the ride home, too shaken to put into words what we'd seen. Later, I looked up stories about that forest, trying to make sense of it, and found legends about creatures that took human forms, mimicking people but with twisted, broken bodies. They were called Skinwalkers, shadows that watched and hunted in the dark. Even now, I can still feel its eyes on me whenever I'm alone, like it's waiting for me to return to the forest. This next story is bone-chilling. Our camping trip was supposed to be a break from the usual, a quiet escape into the heart of nature, away from our buzzing phones and city lights. We planned 3 nights, trekking into the deep woods where cell service was a distant memory. By the second night, we'd set up camp by a quiet stream, surrounded by towering trees. The day had been beautiful, and as the sun set, the forest transformed, taking on a dark, shadowy life of its own. It was so quiet out there that even our own voices seemed out of place, like we were disturbing something ancient and watchful. After dinner, we sat around the fire, telling stories and sharing laughs. One friend had wandered off a little while earlier, so when we heard laughter drifting back to us, we thought it was him, finally returning to camp. But something about the sound didn't sit right. It was too slow, too stretched out, each note holding a strange, echoing quality that made my skin prickle. It circled us, moving through the trees in a way that didn't make sense, like the forest itself was carrying the laughter from one place to another. After a few minutes, our friend still hadn't returned, and the laughter had turned into something sinister. It didn't sound like him anymore. It was louder now, a distorted, hollow version of laughter, as though something was trying to imitate him and failing. Feeling unsettled, one of us grabbed a flashlight and stepped into the dark trees, calling out his name. "Come on, man, cut it out. It's not funny." The laughter stopped suddenly, leaving only silence, thick and heavy. Then, from the other side of the camp, the laughter started again, louder than before, coming from the opposite direction. We looked at each other, dread filling our faces. Whatever was making that sound was moving too quickly, too purposefully. Seconds later, our friend emerged from the trees, walking stiffly toward us, his face pale in the flickering firelight. But there was something wrong. His eyes, usually bright and lively, were dull and unfocused. He moved closer, his mouth twisted into a too-wide smile, his teeth bared in an expression that was anything but friendly. "Are you okay?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. He didn't respond. Instead, he opened his mouth, and out came that same eerie, hollow laughter, echoing through the trees, louder and more distorted. We backed away, too scared to take our eyes off him, not knowing what to do. The laughter went on, too long, like it was stuck on a loop. One friend, braver than the rest of us, grabbed a stick from the fire and held it up as a warning. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice shaking. The figure froze, its head tilted as if it were processing the question. Then slowly it opened its mouth wider, too wide, until it was an impossibly gaping hole, and released a burst of that horrible, empty laughter. We ran. We didn't stop for our things. We didn't stop for each other. We ran through the trees, stumbling and gasping, that laughter following us, bouncing off the trees, as if the whole forest was mocking us. Behind me, I could hear footsteps that weren't quite right. Too quick, too heavy, too inhuman. When we finally broke out of the woods, panting and shaking, we looked around. We were all there, but our friend who had wandered off in the first place was gone. We searched for him the next day, but we only found his flashlight, broken in half, lying on the forest floor. And the strangest thing was, that night, as we huddled in our cars, I could still hear that laughter echoing faintly through the trees, like it was waiting for us to come back. The ending of the next story is shocking. My friends and I were drawn to the thick woods bordering an isolated, misty valley, a spot renowned for its beauty and its eerie stories. We planned to camp for just one night, venturing into the fog-laden forest with our tents and flashlights. The fog was thicker than I'd ever seen, clinging to us and swirling between the trees as we walked. It muffled every sound, every step, and gave everything a strange, dreamlike quality, as if we were slipping into another world. I could barely see a few feet ahead of me, and the deeper we went, the more I started to feel like we weren't alone. We made camp in a small clearing, where the fog settled, blanketing the ground in thick, white tendrils. As night fell, our small fire seemed to be swallowed by the mist, the light barely extending beyond the circle of logs we were sitting on. Everything felt wrong, too quiet. I kept expecting to hear birds or the occasional rustle of leaves, but there was nothing, just an oppressive silence pressing in from every side. Just as I was beginning to voice my concerns, we heard footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from the trees. Everyone fell silent, our eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the fog. The footsteps came closer, each step perfectly measured, like someone, or something, was approaching with intent. Then, through the thick fog, a figure appeared. At first I thought it was a person, maybe another hiker or camper who had gotten lost. But as it moved closer, I noticed it was off. Its body was tall and thin, too thin, almost skeletal, and its arms hung at strange angles. Its movements were slow, jerky, like a puppet on strings. My heart hammered as it stopped just at the edge of the firelight, close enough that I could see its eyes reflecting in the dark, a dull yellow glow that sent chills down my spine. One of my friends called out, but the figure didn't respond. It just stood there, head tilted to the side, watching us. The fog swirled around it, hiding parts of its body as it moved in and out of sight. Then it stepped forward, and I saw its face, or what was supposed to be a face. It was blank, like it had been smudged out, with no features except for those awful, unblinking eyes. Without warning, it opened its mouth, stretching impossibly wide, revealing rows of sharp, gleaming teeth. It let out a guttural, inhuman growl that sent us scrambling to our feet. I grabbed my flashlight, pointing it at the creature, but the light barely pierced the fog. The figure just stood there, its mouth still open, emitting that low, rumbling sound. We ran. I don't remember who ran first, but suddenly we were all sprinting through the fog, stumbling over roots and crashing into trees, desperate to put distance between us and that thing. The fog was so thick that I could barely see my own hands in front of me, and I could still hear those slow, measured footsteps following us, echoing through the mist. After what felt like hours, we finally broke through the tree line, gasping for breath. The fog lifted just enough for us to see each other, but the figure was gone. The forest stood silent and empty behind us, as though nothing had ever been there. But even now, whenever I see fog rolling in, I remember those yellow eyes and that blank, terrible face, and I can't shake the feeling that it's still out there, watching, waiting for me to return. Thanks for watching. Like and subscribe for more videos.